I'd like to welcome everybody. Learning from my mistake last night, my name is Neil Safier, and I actually, very funnily enough, I don't think that Ron Dwight is here, who is the person who asked that question. Turns out that I was actually a renter in his house when I was a fellow here at the JCB in 2002, which may have been the motivation for asking, who the hell are you? In any case, for those of you who haven't had the opportunity to meet me, I'm the new director of the JCB, and this is very much an exploratory kind of operation here. We've been, over the last couple of days, putting together a series of events to look at questions of environmental studies, environmental history here at the library. We started out with a documentary film on Sunday night screened at the Granoff Center called Leviathan. Last night we had a wonderful lecture mainly focused around the 19th century fishing industry in the North Atlantic by Jeffrey Bolster, themes that he picks up on in his book, The Mortal Sea. And today, we are, in a sense, looking both toward the past, since most of the panelists here are people who work on earlier periods of the history of the Americas, but also very much toward the future, thinking about the ways in which institutions like the JCB, and in fact the JCB in particular, can help us to advance thinking about questions of significant import for our own present day and the history of the relationship between humans and their environment. The title of the panel, American Ecologies, purposely uses a kind of an antiquated form of the term ecology to emphasize the fact that even though ecology is a 19th century term, and even though that ecology tends to be associated with 19th and 20th century ideas about the relationship of humans to their environment, or to the environment more generally, really there is a history to that relationship that is our task as historians and as people who are interested in the past to unearth and unveil. And so I have asked these various scholars to come here and to share with us briefly their own perspectives on both what their own work has to offer in terms of environmental history, but where they see it connecting into collections like the JCB and new ways of using these collections in order to ask traditional questions about natural history, commodities, resources, the relationship between humans and the animal worlds, questions that are very much of import in the disciplines of anthropology and other kind of social science literatures. Jeffrey Bolster, who gave the lecture last night, is going to be the moderator for this panel. He is a professor of history at the University of New Hampshire and author of The Mortal Sea, winner of the 2013 Bancroft Prize, among other awards. I'll just go down the line, introduce very briefly the panelists. Molly Warsh is assistant professor of history at the University of Pittsburgh. Her current book project is entitled American Baroque, Pearls and the Nature of Empire, 1492 to 1700, which looks at patterns of natural and human resource exploitation that were established in the early Spanish Caribbean and their impact on early modern imperial practice. It's going to be published by the Omohundro Institute for Early American History and Culture, where Molly held a postdoctoral fellowship from 2010 to 2012. Cameron Strang studies the history of science in early America and how it was informed by local knowledge that was first developed in the Southeast Borderlands region, generally speaking, Florida, Louisiana, and the Caribbean. His article, Violence, Ethnicity, and Human Remains During the Second Seminole War, earned the Lewis Peltzer Memorial Award from the Organization of American Historians in 2013, and is going to be published soon in the Journal of American History. He's currently the Margaret Henry Dabney Pennock Resident Scholar at the Smithsonian Institution Libraries. Loren McClenachan is the Elizabeth and Lee Ainslie Assistant Professor in the Environmental Studies program at Colby College, where she teaches and researches in the fields of historical, ecology, and marine conservation. I like to think of her as our lone scientist here, although it turns out that she's more of a historian than a scientist, perhaps. So that idea goes out the window. Among her many publications, one in particular is of particular relevance to the questions we're going to be addressing today, Marine Historical Ecology, Informing the Future by Learning from the Past. This is a chapter that she co-wrote basically in an edited volume that was published earlier this year. Chris Parsons is an interdisciplinary historian of science and the environment in the French Atlantic world, and as of this past fall is assistant professor of history at Northeastern University in Boston. He's especially interested in the contribution of indigenous peoples to the evolution of European and Euro-American environmental sciences. Marcy Norton is associate professor of history at George Washington University, best known in this particular group as the author of Sacred Gifts, Profane Pleasures, A History of Tobacco and Chocolate in the Atlantic World. And she is working in the field of the historical relationship between humans and animals, and has a book under contract, which I didn't know, with Harvard University Press, and was also a long-term fellow at the JCB. Remind me again which of you have been fellows already at the JCB? Okay, that side of the table. Okay. Yeah, well, hopefully the rest of you can as well. But that'll depend on the short-term selection committee, some of whom are in this room. Be nice to the audience. Last but not least, Joyce Chaplin is James Duncan Phillips Professor of Early American History at Harvard. She has many lectures, articles, and books to her credit in the areas of intellectual history, environmental history, and the history of science. She's just written a fabulous book on circumnavigation. She's no stranger to the library, having lectured here, having been a fellow here, and having participated in many of the activities here. And she has also done a lot of work on the questions related to environmental history, especially the interaction between humans and the natural world. So the way that this is going to work essentially is we'll give each panelist between 5 and 10 minutes, and then we'll just sort of open things up. One particular feature of this event is that arrayed on the other table on the other side of the room is a group of texts and materials from our collection that as soon as we finish here, we're going to be able to go over there and actually take a look at some of the materials with those who selected them, and hopefully take advantage of this space as the library that it is, and the opportunity to take a look at the rare materials and engage in conversation in a more sort of laboratory fashion than perhaps the kind of white-gloved fashion that is normally the case. In any case, I'm really looking forward to hearing from our panelists, and very much encourage you after they're finished to ask questions and engage heartily in the debate and conversation as well. So without further ado, I'll turn things over to Molly.
Thank you. First, I'd like to thank Neil for organizing this today and inviting me to be here, to thank the library too, and of course to thank you all for coming. As Neil mentioned, I am now at the University of Pittsburgh, where I teach world history. I was trained in the 16th and 17th century British and Iberian worlds, and I'm writing this book on exploring the influence of the Caribbean pearl fisheries that were founded in the early 16th century by Spaniards off the coast of Venezuela. And what I'd like to do today is say a few words specifically about an article that I'm working on exploring the way these fisheries evolved. But I'd also like to raise some of the general questions that I'm working with and wrestling with these days, which I think are best addressed not only with an environmental history perspective, but also by an interdisciplinary perspective, which is hardly something that I can claim to have mastered yet, but that is helping me think through this really complex issue of the relationship between humans and the sea and all that the sea produces in the early Atlantic world. I think above all, the largest question that I'm wrestling with in this project is how a consideration of resource extraction and of maritime labor exploitation in the early modern oceanic realm changes our understanding of bureaucratic practice, of imperial practice in the 16th and 17th centuries. And in other words, what I'm trying to do in my approach to the pearl trade is to place this particular commodity trade in its social and economic and cultural context. And I'm hardly the first historian to do this. There's been excellent work done by people like Jenny Anderson, Marcy Norton, Chris Lane, and others who are taking this broad approach to commodity trades. There's a second and related issue here, which is how did early modern empires pursue this issue of improvement, both on land and at sea? How did they develop practices, but also narratives of curatorship over natural resources? How did they understand the relationship between natural histories, for example, and the production and value of different types of labor by different types of subjects? These types of natural histories are, of course, represented very well in the collections of the library, and some of what we will be looking at later today comes out of this collection. How does an understanding of maritime labor and exploitation and attitudes towards the sea and its resources change our idea of the importance of origin and source of products in the early modern period, and of the relationship between different kinds of subjects and knowledge creation, not just wealth creation, but our understandings of the natural world? So this article that I'm working on at the moment, titled The Political Ecology of the Early Spanish Caribbean, considers how the Spanish crown turned to technology to mediate at the perilous intersection of the labor of diverse subjects and the natural world. And this is a topic that has led me to think and read pretty widely on the uses of technology in the modern world, more modern work on modern environmental history. And I think has led me to reflect on the importance of, even if you're an early modernist teaching world history, to be in dialogue with people working on these issues today, because of course the role of technology in helping us care for the natural world or destroying the natural world is one that is still very present. What I argue in this piece is that in these early Spanish Caribbean pearl fisheries, the motley residents of these fisheries, free and unfree from a diverse set of origins, elaborated understandings in these fisheries of the relationship between economies on land and labor regimes at sea, and between the labor of these diverse subjects and the wealth of the empire. And I argue that it's not only the profits, the pearls themselves and the profits that they generated that were the products of these fisheries, but knowledge about this particular ecosystem. And that in the process of this really quite brutal labor regime and its changing relationship with the oyster banks that produce this wealth, these residents of the fisheries put forth a vision of a political economy of empire that had a very fragile human and natural ecology at its heart. So this is what I'm working with right now. This is not only something that I think is of historiographical import for those of us who work on the early Iberian empires. There's still an overwhelming emphasis on the importance of mainland empires and settled sedentary indigenous populations. We tend to ignore the importance of Spain's early maritime experiences in exploiting natural resources and labor regimes around them. But it also speaks to a growing literature very well explored by people at this table on the importance of considering people as ecological actors who both observe and alter the changing sea. So it inserts the sea and ecology back into our understanding of early modern empires. So in a nutshell, you could say that I'm interested in different ways of knowing and different ways of learning that emerged in the 16th and 17th centuries. How do different types of knowledge production and vernacular practices shape what becomes representative of imperial practice of a centralized state? And of course, it's marine and environmental historians who have done such an excellent job of urging us to think about people and situating them within their non-human environment. This is very much a literature with which I'm trying to engage. I think, too, we have, when we're thinking about the relationship of people in the environment and people in the ocean, and their relationship with the ocean and its products, we have to think, too, about the insights brought to us from other disciplines. And I'm thinking here in particular of, oddly enough, Christopher Wood's recent book on temporalities of German Renaissance art, in which he raises, among other questions about whether Germany had a Renaissance, he talks about the changing importance of origin in the early modern period, the idea of tradition versus the origin of the materials being used in the creation of art. And I think that this kind of dialogue between the production of cultural wealth on land and cultural and material wealth at sea might bring about new insights into what shapes our notions of value, both on land and on ships and underwater. Another work that I'll cite as having been of particular importance to me is Pamela Smith's work, The Body of the Artisan, thinking about the role of people who work, of artisans themselves in informing ideas of knowledge and the uses of art. I think here too, her work has led me to think about the importance, again, of labor conditions in shaping the perceptions of value of the goods that are circulating around the Atlantic world. And lastly, I'll say taxonomies of empire, the vocabularies that we use, that were generated in this period and that we use to discuss the emerging material world that is circulating around the Atlantic and beyond in this period. There have been excellent insights from scholars of early colonial literature that help us think about colonial vocabularies and how vocabularies of human environmental exploitation informed each other. And I think it's really only in dialogue with these arenas, these various arenas of exploitation, of cultivation, and of curation on land, in print, at sea, in art, across all of these different arenas, that we can develop a holistic understanding of what all of the various factors that are shaping the formation of the modern world. And I'll leave it at that.
Super. Perfect. 8 minutes.
8 minutes, right on target.
Good job. All right. Yeah.
Sure, and thank you all for being here, and I hope those of you for whom I'm on the other side of the lamp can see me a bit. So I'm going to talk about Borderlands, and it doesn't move. I'm going to talk about Borderlands and environmental history, and as Neil mentioned yesterday, environments don't necessarily care very much about national boundaries, but what I want to discuss is how individuals in the early borderlands actually produced environmental histories, and I'm thinking specifically of North American borderlands, late 18th, early 19th centuries. That is, they wrote accounts and produced accounts of how human interactions among different populations and with the environment shaped the environment and shaped those populations. For one, this suggests a new genealogy, or at least a different genealogy for the historiography of early American environmental history. Most practitioners of the field tend to place the origins in the mid-20th century, or for some borderlands historians, push it back to the Turner thesis of the 1890s. As Alfred Crosby said, historians of the frontier were pre-adapted to being environmental historians by Turner. But whereas the significance of Turner's frontier was for Anglos and for the greater Anglo nation as he saw it, the environmental histories that people were writing around 1800 in the borderlands were much more multicultural and really saw this as essential to understanding these relationships with the environment. And I'd say there's hundreds such of these histories here at the JCB that haven't been approached in this way. And that I think this is something that historians now are only starting to recapture, that it was these very multivalent relationships among different peoples, empires, and environments that made these worlds what they were. So I'm going to run through a few quick and dirty examples of some of these histories, and then end with some bigger questions that maybe they raise. First are native stories that come out of the Spanish-American borderlands, around 1800, that are environmental histories that are looking back to the era of the first Spanish conquest and the first trials. And a lot of what they're interpreting is the relationship between specific environments with precious metals and mineral resources, sort of dangerous powers, and Spanish colonialism. So some of these come out of the Southwest, where you have these mines where native accounts, native histories of the region place these sort of evil Spanish spirits as intrinsic to the landscape. There's a lake apparently in New Mexico that has this big monster in it that looks like a Spaniard, according to these stories. They say it has this big, broad-brimmed hat like a Spaniard, and that, you know, all these histories say stay away from this place because it's where the spirits of the first Spaniards to conquer our region now reside. So obviously this is dangerous territory. And you see these coming out of built environments as well, such as the missions in Spanish Florida, where there wasn't necessarily mineral resources, but you have these creek histories coming 100 years after the ruin of some of these missions, that the Spanish had buried all of this treasure and church ornaments under these sites, but we can't unearth this stuff because it would be bring this sort of death and evil that had initially been associated with at specific environments where precious metals, Spanish colonialism, and natives all came together. So this is a pretty accurate way to interpret a lot of the early contact period. But it wasn't just natives producing these histories, white folks did as well. And a lot of the people most invested in this were geologists, which makes sense because they're doing Earth history. But these weren't necessarily dry scientific narratives. For example, there's this guy named Timothy Conrad, who's a young romantic geologist, and he writes this sort of imagined dream history of Mobile, which was just West Florida and recently become part of the United States. And he starts his history of Mobile when it's beneath the ocean, and he starts talking about how the accumulation of sediments is starting to make dry land, and then insects show up, and then we have megafauna, and eventually he sees the arrival of natives who he calls these sort of embodiments of wild nature and savagery. But the story he ends up narrating is how the arrival of Europeans and then Anglo-Americans ends up changing this environment so much that it becomes an ecosystem where natives can no longer survive. And this is because he sees natives as inherently unchangeable, whereas environments do change. And I think the way he puts it is that pretty soon natives will be as extinct in this region as bison, and eventually have even disappear from memory because their presence in this specific environment is so impossible. But whereas you see guys like Conrad have this, it reflects contemporary Whiggish versions of American history in some ways. But at the same period, early 1800s, you have other geologists in the region who are using the environment to do revisionist histories. And I'm thinking specifically of a guy named Rush Nutt, who was a planter in Mississippi. And he looked to the environment and to bodies and biology as a more accurate archive for getting at the past, because he saw textual sources as inherently flawed, because according to him, priests had always been in the habit of manipulating the historical record to hide all their atrocities. So, as he put it, all history is but a fable, and that of the most absurd kind. So he started looking to what he considered presently observable social, environmental, and biological processes, and doing this radical upstreaming project to reinterpret older histories. And a lot of what he finds is not too dissimilar to what environmental historians are doing now, except he sees the time frame as much more compressed. For example, he sees the combined agency of cattle and white farmers and winds and fire creating the western prairies sometime in the 18th century. And natives also fit very much in this story about the creation of the North American continent. He has Native American, especially burning cane brakes, creating the Mississippi River around the year 400 or 500. So what happens is that humans change this environment, this changes the climate, and this changes the effect of the continent on people's bodies. So, I mean, it's a much more deterministic view than we have now, but very similar approach to looking at this relationship between humans and nature as mutually constitutive. So, I guess the question we're left with now is, are these things environmental history? And, I think this is a valuable question to raise. Some of it is obviously more recognizable, such as in terms of practices and goals, such as rushnut using, looking at specific soils and plants and wind patterns to see how the land has changed, and then doing so to do revisionist history instead of textual sources that his peers were using. But then we have, Conrad's more imaginative, dreamlike deep history and these native stories about colonialism, and do these fit in? I'd say, for me, Borderlands are very useful for historical thinking because they draw attention to these boundaries, and more often than not make boundaries appear far less clear than we might expect. And so while these older histories not only sort of suggest a different genealogy, I think that they help blur the conceptual and disciplinary boundaries of what environmental history has become. And if this helps us get a better sense of how people in the past related with their world and embedded themselves in it, I think that that's valuable. I think it's even more valuable if, coming out of this tradition helps us tell new stories that wouldn't be possible within the methodological constraints of environmental history as it now is. So I guess the takeaway message is that perhaps if we decenter the historiographical roots of environmental history as we now see it as this thing emerging in the 20th century, maybe with roots in the frontier thesis, and instead see that as one road taken out of a much older and diverse and in a way contested historiographical tradition going back to these sites of intercultural encounter. I think that might be a way to make environmental history something more nebulous, more full of possibility, and maybe more fun.
Thanks, Ken.
All right.
Okay, so I wanted to talk about, as the token ecologist on the panel, the ways that historical data have been used in ecosystem-based questions. And I wanted to start us off not in the library, but out in the ocean itself. So this is sort of a typical modern Caribbean reef. We have a few fish, not a whole lot of fish in the water. We have the benthic structure is covered with algae, which is what those purple and green things are representing. And we have an intrepid ecologist in the water there recording it all. If we go back to 1980, this is what a typical Caribbean reef looked like. So those little asterisks there are meant to represent the diadema urchin, which experienced a die-off in 1983, and the results of that were a complete phase shift in that ecosystem, meaning that the coral, which used to dominate the benthic structure, was replaced by the algae. And so the question is, what happened before that, right? So what was it that facilitated this transition to happen? And one of the hypotheses is that the functional redundancy of having lots of herbivores in the ecosystem was eliminated a long time ago by fishing, so that the system that was left when ecologists began to study it in the 1950s and 1960s was already altered, and so it was sort of primed for this change that happened really rapidly later. But the problem is that there weren't ecologists in the water in the 1940s and 30s and before that. So we have a really hard time substantiating that with the ecological data that we have. So we really need to start thinking about incorporating other kinds of information. So to put this another way, this is, I think, the only graph I have in here. The most well-studied ecosystems are highly altered. So what this is showing is it's the decline of coral cover in the Caribbean since the late 1970s, which is the black line, and then the white dots there are the number of studies that went into making that observation. So we have a whole lot of people in the water studying these degraded ecosystems, but we really have no way to describe more pristine ecosystems using ecological data. So observations like this is what led to the field of marine historical ecology, which distinguishes itself from marine environmental history in that it's focused in the questions come out of ecology. And so this is a paper that was published in 2001 in Science, which sort of kick-started people thinking about these issues. And so The observations were that the recent ecological change, like the change in the Caribbean from coral-dominated systems to those dominated by algae, have historical roots that really go back to when people first became active predators in that environment. So in some cases, hundreds and thousands of years before that. And so we really can't get at this as ecologists with traditional ecological data. We need to start thinking about other sources to inform the observation of change that we see in the ecosystems that we exist in today. So the sort of the bigger reasons that this matters in terms of conservation and management is this idea of shifting baselines and the loss of knowledge about ecosystem potential. So Daniel Pauly, who's a fisheries scientist, coined this term, the shifting baseline syndrome, in the 90s. And basically, it's the idea that people assume that when they first observe an environment, it's the natural state, and any change that happens after that is unnatural. But that generations of this happening really results in us losing our sense of what the potential of ecosystems is for productivity, for resilience, and for overall function. And so this is one example of that, these pictures here. This is the bottom picture. You can see it is it's the largest fish caught on a charter boat in Key West in 2007. And I took a bunch of pictures. That was actually the largest fish that was caught in a week in Key West. And this is the bigger picture is from the 1950s in the same spot. So a lot of change in terms of what our relationship is to these ecosystems and these big mega vertebrates that sort of very often characterize our connection to these environments. So I just wanted to give a few examples of historically relevant sources, so things that I and others have used to extract ecological data that can sort of help us understand how ecosystems have changed over longer time periods than ecologists have been in the water. And this is one example from my work. So this is a picture taken of a fish that were caught on a charter boat in Key West in 1957. So these are the big fish that are hanging there, are Goliath grouper. These are now critically endangered around the world. They're not definitely not found in that abundance anymore. There's some big sharks that are sort of nestled on the ground there. And so so these are kind of neat pictures in the sense that they give a sense of the historical connection to this environment. People used to really enjoy going out fishing, and they got a lot out of it sort of culturally, but there's also extractable ecological data that can be taken out of here with respect to the species that were caught, the size of those fish that were caught over time. And so when we compare that to, this is a picture that was taken in the very same spot in 2007, you can see that there's a really big difference just visually, but in terms of the ability to quantify this change, we found that there's a 90% decline in the size of these big trophy fish that were caught over time, and also big changes in terms of the species that were targeted, basically showing that the big fish have just disappeared from these ecosystems. So other examples of historically relevant sources, or ecologically relevant historical sources, Hawaiian restaurant menus. These are examples in the lower, in the corner there. Restaurant menus that show the fish, the types of fish that were served over time. So we don't have we have very little catch information from the fishery itself in the beginning of the 20th century, but these are really neat, sort of beautiful tourist keepsakes. And so people keep these in archives and in private collections. And so if you go through and pull out what the fish that were served are, you have some idea of how the fishery changed over time. Shipping records. This is an image of a shipping record of seal oil that we found in the Public Records Office in the UK. There's so the Caribbean monk seal is now extinct. It went extinct in 1952, and there's a lot of question about what its historical population size was and how that affected the overall Caribbean ecosystem. And so pieces of information like this are really helpful in terms of getting a sense for the industry that was surrounding this species and the size of the population that could have existed. So just to kind of, I guess I have a couple other graphs to show how this information is then taken and turned into ecology. This is the data taken from the menus. Basically, they showed shifts over basically the 1930s and 1940s from reef fish to pelagic fish, which support other observational data that the reef fish had really become depleted in this time period, but this sort of helps put a little bit more of a more precise timing on that. And then in terms of the monk seal, this is a compilation of a bunch of different historical sources, just mapping them over time. And when we look at that, something really interesting comes out, which is that their range in historically was basically the entire Caribbean basin. And as we move forward in time, they shrink. The population range shrinks in towards the center, and the very last colony, which is that black circle there, was found pretty much right in the center of the historical range. So your perspective on the importance of this species in the ecosystem really shifts depending on what your baseline is or your time frame. So people in the early 1900s were saying this is a pretty rare species. It's only found on a few islands in the western part of the Caribbean, but that was because that historical knowledge about the distribution of that species had been lost over time. So I think I will leave it there. I have a couple of images of the things that I've just found here that I had run across in other contexts that I didn't realize were here. This is the actually turned into the cover of this really influential science paper. So I was pretty excited to find that. And then these pictures of people turning turtles in the Caribbean were also things I had come across and that had actually been used in terms of publicizing the results of some of these studies, but I didn't know that they were found here, so that's pretty neat.
So as Neil, let me just change this for a sec. So as Neil mentioned, I just started teaching in the fall at Northeastern University, and one of the best parts about teaching there is teaching an environmental history course that is actually a required course for environmental studies majors. This is one of the only humanities courses that they have to take, and so this is my chance to impress upon people who go on to be actual environmental scientists the importance of history. And so this impressed upon me a bit not just the relevance of the field of environmental history, but the field that I'm interested in, which is much more populated with unicorns and sea monsters and fantastical creatures like that, much more so than people like Rachel Carson or usable data points or this sort of thing. So I've asked myself a great deal why, and actually looking through my talk this morning, I was struck by how many times I saw the word why in my paper. Maybe you'll agree. But fundamentally, I think the question that I had for myself was twofold. Why should environmental historians and environmental studies people pay attention to early Americanists and historians of the Atlantic world? And why, and I think this is one of the assumptions here, why should early Americanists and historians of the Atlantic world pay more attention to the ecology, pay more attention to telling stories about ecologies, about plants or animals or places? This is actually also a question that Cameron and I asked ourselves as we put together a special issue of a journal that'll appear in a year, Early American Studies. I can never remember if it's actually called Environments in Early America or Early America and the Environment, but you get the idea. And so we asked ourselves these questions. What can early American environmental history do? They're fields that aren't necessarily easy or even frequent allies. There was a recent review by Peter Mancall in the William & Mary Quarterly that talked about the relatively irregular appearance of environmental history in the major journals of our field, and the equally rare sightings of early Americanists at conferences such as the American Society for Environmental History or in publications such as their journal, Environmental History. And I think that there's a couple of reasons for this. Clearly there is a problem if you are going back in time and looking for data that doesn't exist in an era before the quantification on the scale that you can find in 19th century, before you find the sort of scientific expeditions that gather the sorts of data that are useful for people like you. Standing in for all scientists. But I also think one of the things that our field has seemed to lack is the sort of easy connection to the moral project of environmental history as it's understood in the 20th century, which is the project to convert, the project to raise awareness, the project to, Donald Warster, a very famous environmental historian, said it was nothing less than saving the world. So how do unicorns and sea monsters and that sort of stuff fit into that project? It's not an easy fix. So what can we do? Is there a usual past in early American history for environmental studies or environmental historians? What does it look like? I'd like to say that it starts with a shift towards recognizing the importance of recovering epistemologies as much as ecosystems, and that is what we can contribute. And I'm going to answer that through a little story about one particular plant that I found a few years ago in Paris. So this is cocoa car. That's a close-up of it, a little camera shot. This was one page of a 13-page document sent from the island of Cape Breton, the fortress of Louisbourg, to Paris in and around 1725, written by someone named François-Madeleine Vallée, who, trying to make a sort of survey of the area, its potential resources, its potential wealth, canvassed amongst local indigenous peoples, amongst local colonists, for plants that he might send back to France. This was one of them, cocoa car. It's probably one of the more beautiful pages that you can see. And you can see that there is an effort to send the plant. The name of this document was actually the memoir for the plants that are, or memoir to accompany the plants which are in case B. So clearly this was sent along with physical specimens, seeds, roots, these sorts of things. But he also records a lot of sort of ethnographic information that we might recognize today as important. He mentions, for example, that the Creoles call it the fatty or greasy herb, l'herbe graisse, but it was sent to Paris under an indigenous name, and he mentions specifically in this indigenous uses of the plant and where it grows natively in on Cape Breton. So this in and of itself was interesting for me, this idea that the local Acadian population, the Native Americans, were sharing this plant, were telling each other about this, had similar names for it. This sort of layering of appropriations, of reappropriations. And yet working with botanists at Acadia University, I found out more about this plant. You might not be able to see it there, and you certainly couldn't see it outside right now, but this is a plant that you can actually probably see it growing in between the sidewalks around here, and certainly down on the water coast where Vallée would have seen it. He says that it grows in the sort of roughs, somewhere between, there isn't quite an English word that I can find, but somewhere between gravel and sand is where this grows on the seacoast. But this is actually Plantago major, common plantain, which was actually introduced from Europe at some point over the 16th century. And so I found it remarkable that by the 17th century, by the 18th century, this plant had become so embedded in local indigenous and colonial context that it could be sent back to France as an entirely new thing. And not just a new thing that was valuable for curiosity or to fill out scientific taxonomies, but because it had uses that colonists and Native Americans had discovered that Europeans might not know. Okay, so what does this one plant show? What I think this shows is how one plant, as it crossed the Atlantic, could become two, could become three. And I think we'd be mistaken to suggest that this was simply one plant and each new name was a veneer, that you can actually separate the natural and cultural history of cocoa car. So the environmental histories that have always inspired me, books like Marcia Weissager's Dreaming of Sheep in Navajo Country or Julie Cruikshank's Do Glaciers Listen, are those that always took seriously the challenge of examining how, paraphrasing William Cronin, who I'm surprisingly the first person to bring up so far, how diverse peoples have belonged to ecologies and how in turn their ecologies belong to them. So Julie Cruikshank listened to Pacific Northwest Aboriginal peoples who thought that bacon fat could anger the beings who lived in these great bodies of ice and make them behave in different ways. Marcia Weissager, studying the 20th century Navajo, took seriously Navajo origin stories that placed sheep, a clearly scientifically introduced species, in their origin stories. So what they tell are messy stories of the co-creation of entangled cultural and material worlds. And I think that this is what environmental history can and ought to do. It offers a particularly rich venue to explore the encounter between the mental and the material world that create the ecosystems that we know and live in. So I think this is the sort of history that a plant like cocoa coir encourages us to tell. These should be our models when we work with plants like this, and it's to indigenous and vernacular knowledges such as this that we should look, not just with an eye towards the restoration of a native ecosystem. Clearly, if we were restoring this ecosystem, we should say that this plant should be torn out. It's an introduced invasive species. But so instead, we should look to recover the epistemology here, the creation of possibilities. And this seems particularly important to me today. I'm not the first person to comment on the demonstrable links between cultural and biodiversity. This is something that is showing up in scientific journals, in anthropological journals. There's a clear relationship. Where there are more cultures, there is a greater biodiversity. Where biodiversity decreases, linguistic, all sorts of ways of measuring cultural diversity decrease. So this is what we might contribute as early Americanists, I think. Not necessarily trying to actually reconstruct these epistemologies, but suggesting that alternatives exist. I was quite struck, Jeff, last night when you said that one of the problems for some of these fishermen is they just could not imagine alternative ways of belonging to an ecology. So that's what I think we can at least demonstrate. So just quickly, this is the journal, the profile of some of the people that submitted to Cameron and I's panel. There's a few bar charts, nothing too complex, but the takeaway is that primarily they're historians, and they're young, and they're working in Anglo-American topics. And so I think this is actually why somewhere like the JCB is so important to this. We're surrounded right now by sources in Portuguese, in Spanish, in French, by scholars of literature, by historians, by scientists. This seems like an ideal place to bring together the people who can actually show this diversity, this epistemological diversity that I think is so important. So what would I say at the end about what environmental history needs? I think environmental history needs unicorns. I think environmental history needs the sea monsters that Jeff talked about last night. And I think that if we're going to tell the history of common plantain, we also have to make sure there's room for cocoa coir. Thank you. Oh yeah. Maybe. There it is. Which one are you?
How do we make it live? Hi. Let me start by reiterating the thanks to Neil for bringing us all together and just the appreciation for this library. It's an amazing place to bring people together to have these kinds of conversations. So I'm going to try to do two things in my brief remarks, which is, I'm sure it's overly ambitious, but I think there's a way to do it. And the first is to talk about different approaches to animals in historical scholarship. And the reason for doing this is I think it has a sometimes awkward fit with environmental history, and I'd like to explore some of those issues. And secondly, I'll talk about one of my case studies looking at human-animal relationships in the early colonial world. So very oversimplified, you could say animals are taken as objects, agents, and subjects. Objects is probably the way that we're most familiar with them. When we think of Levi-Strauss's dictum, animals are good to think with, we generate histories about animals that can tell us things such as the history of anthropocentrism, bourgeois domesticity, Enlightenment science, where animals, seeing how people study animals, reveal these larger categories. But people have felt that that doesn't go far enough. So in the words of Jonathan Burt, animals as objects of human analysis are not enough. They also need to be seen as beings in the world who may themselves create change. So we have animals as actors. And I would say in traditional environmental history, which again is totally misleading label, but as a shorthand, we have animals as a component of nature. So nature is sort of the ecology that we were just hearing about, that is a large, multi-species, complex systems, and animals figure within that as one of the component parts of nature. And you can see this in sort of traditional histories of the Columbian exchange that look at animals alongside plants as sort of going back and forth across the Atlantic and the impacts they have on local ecologies. And then you have a tradition with quite a different lineage, which wants to see animals, albeit certain animals, as historical subjects. And this comes from an intellectual tradition that is interested in deconstructing the Enlightenment subject as being characterized by rationality and certain kinds of cognition and language and so forth. So in the words of Carrie Wolf, rather than looking at the subject organized around reason, we need to look at how our shared embodiment, mortality, and finitude make us fellow creatures in ways that subsume the more traditional markers of ethical consideration, such as the capacity for reason and the ability to enter into contractual agreement or reciprocal behaviors, and so on. And so in this schema, certain animals, other primates come to mind, dogs, so forth, certain kinds of charismatic animals are seen as sort of with us in this group of subjects and deserve similar kinds of consideration. So I've been wrestling in how to sort of reconcile these different approaches and also think about what my study, focusing right now on indigenous ways of interacting with animals, where this might fit in. So now I'm going to shift gears and talk a little bit about this research. So when beginning this project, I started in a kind of obvious place, looking at early chronicles about the Americas, just looking for how animals appeared. And one of the things that continually struck me was the preponderance of descriptions of Native Americans capturing wild animals and taming them. So the obvious examples of this would be parrots and monkeys. And in fact, the very first encounter with Columbus, as recorded by Las Casas, involved some exchange of parrots. And we sort of take this for granted, the image of a parrot, but when you think about it further, it's kind of a weird thing. Like, why were people walking around with parrots? They didn't know Europeans like parrots. And what this has turned out to be is kind of a tip of an iceberg. So as I started reading more and more of these sources, I kept collecting these examples. And I'll just represent it actually briefly with some images. That's what I was just talking about. So in the beginning, focusing in the Greater Antilles, the Lesser Antilles, the coastal areas known as the Tierra Firme, and so a work like the Drake manuscript, which is, there's a lot of mystery about this, but we don't know who the author or the artists were, decides to identify the Indians of Trinidad and of Nicaragua through the practice of parrot capture. Like, this was such an important practice that it sort of called its attention. And in other images where the text wouldn't address it, you just see a lot of these tamed animals in part of the domestic milieu. A very other famous source for many of us here is Guaman Poma's Nuevo Crónico y Buen Gobierno. And when he is trying to represent the eastern Andean area of the Inca Empire that goes into the rainforest, he too sort of focuses in on, well, the monkey and the tame parrot there as well. So anyway, this is my initial attempt to start tabulating this information. But as I was doing this research, I felt like there was one sort of vital missing link, which was, if this was as an important phenomena as I thought it was, there should be some sort of meta-commentary about that as well. And this is where my JCP research in particular was very helpful. I went through this dictionary. This is a marvelous source by a missionary, Raymond Breton, that's called, as you can see, Dictionary Carib French, but it's full of ethnographic information. And in it, there was sort of my smoking gun, where he has this term called yeg, which he has on both sides of the dictionary, which he defines as an animal that one feeds, emphasizing the nurturing and the proprietary aspects of the world. And then he further illuminated the concept by explaining that his hosts, who are Kalinago or island Caribs, did not raise these animals in order to eat, but rather they were kept for diversion or for their services, such as wake-up cries of roosters, feathers of brightly plumaged birds,
or the help of dogs in hunting pigs and agouti. He concluded by saying if they have chickens, they would die before eating them. So in this statement, we see one of the key differences by how this concept of yegg is very different than both European livestock and the European notion of pets. Because of course, central to raising European livestock is you raise them and then you kill them and use them. Central to the European notion of pets is that you don't kill other members of the same species that you have as a pet. So not only do you not kill your own dog, but you also don't kill anyone else's dogs in sort of Euro-American culture. In the concept of egg, the same animals that were prime candidates for this raising as sort of in a kinship system were also hunted in other contexts. And actually, this is represented nicely visually in the image here on the left, where you have the dead bird and the live bird, the sort of equivalence between them. So then my next thought was, well, again, if this is as important phenomena as I think it should be, as it appears to be, then wouldn't I expect to find it also in more recent ethnographies of Amazonian and Orinoco groups who are culturally affiliated with these Caribbean groups? So then I started going through more contemporary ethnographies. This is, again, you can't see it, but you'll take my word for it, it's 19th and 20th century. And sure enough, found the same phenomena described there, which was good news and bad news for me. Good news because it appeared I was right. Bad news because I wasn't as original as I had thought I was. But I was particularly struck by the description of an ethnographer named Patrick Manger, who was working in one of the tributaries of the Amazon in the 1960s and 70s, a place very far from Dominica, where my source for Raymond Breton came from. And his description of a concept known as egu, E-G-U, very similar to egg, also a Carib-speaking group, which is defined as a familiar animal who lives in one's lodging. Among the egu present in his field sites were macaws, parrots, as well as aquatic species, monkeys, capybara. And he noted that it was also applied to kidnapped children brought in to replace the dead, as well as to trophies from enemy cadavers, in particular flutes made of bones and teeth. And so this was further support for the hypothesis that I was developing, that there's an equivalence between relations with non-human animals and with humans, where one of the characteristics of warfare in these regions is that if you would take enemies, you might kill and ritually consume some of them, usually men, and women and children you would bring into your household. And so this is an equivalent structure between humans and animals. Now the significance of all of this is on a number of levels, but I just want to conclude by mentioning two important features of it, which has to do with how we look at the Columbian exchange, to sort of return to where I began. One of the ways that this affects the Columbian exchange, the way Europeans and Native Americans experience the environment, was it helps to explain how indigenous groups took in European domestic animals, such as the chicken. And one of the things I found is that the kind of reaction to chickens is more or less identical in regions separated by 500 years, depending on the time of contact, where there's a real interest in bringing in chickens, but once they're brought into the community, the idea of actually killing them is really horrible. So just as Europeans have a sort of taboo against eating human flesh, for these groups of Native Americans, the taboo is against eating a tame being. And I'll conclude there.
I'll begin with a brief gracias and I'll focus my comments on the question, the problem of human population, population density, and its relation to natural resources. Oh, sorry. Should I start over or not? Even the cameraman shakes his head. Yes, gracias. Again. And I'm particularly going to stress how this question of population and its density in relation to natural resources in its modern form that we are all probably familiar with is intrinsically related to European exploration, colonization, and control of the Americas. As I talk, I'm going to use the power of the spoken word merely, no images, but I'll gesture toward three texts, the three texts that I've chosen to be laid out for you to look at in a bit. And I'll conclude with some comments on a fourth text that isn't there. So, this question of human population. In environmental terms that we think about today, what kind of impact do different sized populations have on natural places? The Americas were very much central to this, the posing of this question in this way. Very early on, European perceptions of the Americas emphasized, with some exceptions, that there was very low population density, and this is particularly the case for North America, for parts of South America, obviously not all of South America, but it remains a kind of stigmatizing stereotype of the scarcity of population over much of the Americas. This perception was augmented by what's been called the Great Dying, the impact of epidemic disease, communicable diseases, among native populations, diseases to which they had little or no resistance. The first text that I've laid out for you to look at is Mort's Relation, an early description of New England that emphasizes this point about low population density. So I think the text is open to a letter written describing New England to potential English settlers, saying it would grieve your heart if you saw all this land being unused. So really well encapsulating that European sense. Where are the people? Why are the resources not being used as intensively as they possibly could be? I'm not going to necessarily say whether these descriptions were accurate in terms of what Native American populations were actually like, but again, I want to stress that this is a really deeply ingrained impression that Europeans had about the New World. There was something distinctive about it in population terms, and there's something, therefore, intrinsically different about the Americas compared to Europe. The second text that I've asked to be laid out and opened is Locke's Two Treatises of Government, which emphasizes not so much the population question, so much as the potential use of natural resources in the form of property. Is this being done in the Americas? Is this what Indians do? And Locke's conclusion is that no, there is not the intensive use or development or definition of natural resources as property. That is something, again, quite distinctive to the Americas. And in his famous line, he says, in the beginning, all the world was America in this regard. So he sets up a kind of historical trajectory using the Americas as a hypothetical starting point for the development of human society and its intensifying use of natural resources, which he obviously assumed was being concluded within Europe, but that America offered a kind of more or less pristine example of the before picture. So in the beginning, all the world was America. From descriptions that proliferated in this way in the 16th and 17th centuries, European and increasingly Creole observers of the Americas moved to prescriptions and predictions, so not just what they thought the Americas looked like, but what ought to be done with them. In a sense, this had always been latent, as with that, it would grieve your heart to see land not being used, obviously an invitation for something to change. But moving into the 18th century, there is much more of an emphasis on, therefore, what should settler populations do? This question was eventually framed within an emerging science of demography, known at the time, by the end of the 17th century and going into the 18th century, as political arithmetic, the counting of people, generally in order to calculate their political significance, encompassing their capacity to make war, but also to be economic actors. So to go back to the way in which ecologies and economies become interlinked, imagined states for the world through the human use of natural resources. So moving from descriptions of the Americas to prescriptions or predictions of what the Americas should be, and therefore what Europeans could do to parts of the world that resembled the Americas. The imagined scenario is usually, obviously, that settler populations would move into these vacant spaces and take up land that was not being used or not being used intensively, fill in vacant space, develop natural resources. So I moved to the third text that I've asked to be laid out by Benjamin Franklin. His observations concerning the increase of mankind, first written in 1751, revised several times, and going into really quite a remarkable circulation, especially during the American Revolution, when both patriots and British readers could draw the same conclusions, whatever differences they might have had politically, but agreeing with Franklin that settler populations in North America were growing at historically unprecedented rates. So Franklin says that the settler population in North America is doubling every 20 years, which seemed incredibly fast to people at the time. And there was, in fact, some questioning of whether it could actually be true that any human population could double their numbers in 20 years. In fact, the first US Census of 1790 vindicates Franklin, which he wouldn't know necessarily. But it is a hypothesis that is fascinating to people at the time, and establishing again the power of political arithmetic as used to describe a new world scenario in order to talk about how human beings could increase so rapidly given the proper conditions. And the proper conditions for Franklin were having enough land in order to encourage young people to marry at young ages and therefore produce larger families. That was the motor. That was exactly what created this seemingly historically unprecedented quick growth of population. And I emphasize the context that Franklin did, which was colonization and imperialism. He was very clear in talking about how it was political control of New World land by invasive populations, not the native population. So that context that had always been there to a certain extent is very much emphasized in Franklin's observations concerning the increase of mankind, again, framing a human economic significance around an ecological, a natural scenario. And so, moving from Franklin to an invisible text, not laid out on the table and back, Thomas Robert Malthus, his book, which turned this observation, Franklin's observation, into Malthusianism. In his 1798 essay on the principle of population, Malthus took Franklin's calculation, human populations can double in size every 20 years. He tweaked it slightly to make two different statements. First, that humans increase at geometrical rates. They can, under the right circumstances, and Malthus points especially to New World environments. He says, yes, that's exactly where it will happen, where there is a vacant space for settler populations to move into. Humans can increase at a geometrical rate. But, he says, their food sources can only increase at an arithmetical rate. We're still wondering why he said that, but he did. And this has remained a very powerful contrast that has been debated. Is that true? Is either of them true? Are both of these statements true? Nevertheless, it set the contours of continuing argumentation about human population, their impact on the natural world, and whether there will be enough natural resources to continue to sustain them. Those were the terms of the debate that, as it was laid out by 1798, building on several earlier centuries of observations about the Americas. I would argue that this is one of the most important statements about the natural world and the human place within it that was not simply, it didn't simply come into being in the Americas, it had the Americas in mind. So I turn again to our leader and ask why there is no copy of Malthus at the JCB. I think I've checked Josiah pretty carefully, and I don't think it's there. So I think I'll end with that querulous question. Thank you.
Thanks to all of the panelists. Been some marvelous and stimulating observations here. I'm just going to take about 2 minutes and try to stitch them together a little bit. Number one, must one be an environmentalist to write environmental history? We heard Don Worcester's observation quoted earlier that in some ways, at least in the late 20th century, that was the incentive. I think as we sit here surrounded by these marvelous sources from the past, we realize that isn't the case. And I think that actually no, but one must honor past people on their own terms. Part of what I've heard here today is some wonderful observations about people as ecological actors, about how we as humanists can recover lost epistemologies and tell new stories. And I think that we have a chance here with the kind of resources in the JCB that speak to that relationship between humans and the natural world to do just those sorts of things, whether they're creation stories or stories that are cautionary tales and the rest. I think we've also heard here some important observations and queries about scale. The first was when Loren put up some graphs and suggested that the scale of ecological thought was just really distorted and need to be historicized. And then at the end here, Joyce is raising questions of scale about carrying capacity and how people imagine. Malthus hadn't met Monsanto. He thought that food was limited arithmetically, but in any event, it seems to me that one of the ways we might think about this going forward is that, from my perception at least, we have two basic approaches here. One is some of what Loren was getting at and some of the others about recovering baselines from the past, trying to understand the nature of nature at different points and places in the past. And that's one of the goals of historical ecology and sometimes a goal of environmental history, recovering what the past looked like at different places. And that fits very well with policy-driven questions today about ecological restoration. But another piece that's going on here is very much recovering these lost epistemologies. I loved Chris's stories about cocoa coir, the plant that had been naturalized in Cape Breton for over a century and was then returned to Europe as a New World product because people in the New World had Americanized it and actually brought their own understandings and interpretations to it. That's a marvelous story. It seems to me that one way that we might get at sort of fusing these two, if it's worthwhile, is paying more attention to what writers like Michael Pollan and others have referred to as second nature. The fact that nature is constantly changing, that it is not external to us, that we are inextricably involved with it, we as human beings, have been for a very long time, as some of the panelists here have observed. And that when looking in the past to certain historically specific times and places, we're not looking for some nature that is external to humans, but one that has already been changed and been affected. So questions become, how did people use the past, or how did people use natural resources? How did they change them? And then ultimately, how were they dealing with the new reality that was there, that shifting baseline syndrome that Daniel Pauly presented. So I think that it's quite possible, using some of the resources here going forward, to imagine building some new histories like that tell new stories, that not only try to reconstruct baselines from the past, but that also very much pay attention to people as ecological actors and how they were using that constantly refashioned nature. So I think I'll leave it like that and open for questions, panelists questioning of each other, or questions as well from the audience. Thank you. Yes.
I wonder if any of you could comment more on the word pristine. Loren used a phrase, if I got it correctly, of saying the most well-studied ecosystems are highly degraded and not pristine. And Joyce, I think, also used that word pristine. There's a value judgment. There's sort of a golden age somewhere back there when nature existed without us, I think is what we're getting at. My understanding, at least in this part of the world, is that the only time nature existed without us was when it was covered by glaciers. That as the glaciers receded, the people followed, and there's no such thing as New England before there were people in it. So I wondered if you could make, to me, there's a kind of conceptual problem with imagining, and I hear ecologists do it, if only we could go back to what it was like when there were no people, and yet there is no such. It seems to me there really is kind of a conceptual issue of whether that's even a concept worth looking at. I don't know if you could.
Yeah, I can start to address that. So I think it is a very loaded term, and I've been in many conversations with ecologists and historians sort of talking about other ways to say the same thing, which is that you're right, there are, part of the story of historical ecology, at least, is that people have been part of these environments for a long time, but the other part is that people have been altering these ecosystems for a long time in ways that can be measured. So I think that as the representing all of science, I think that there's a danger to saying that there's no such thing as pristine, there's no such thing as ecosystems without people, because I think there's a truth to that, but I think there's also a lot of nuance that gets lost when you say it's all relative, right? I think there are ways that you can actually go and look to see how ecosystems function at different degrees of human impact. And so people have looked at the same sort of things that I talked about by looking at island chains that have different population sizes that affect the fish communities in different ways. And so, you know, in island communities that have no people, the reefs look very different than ones that have, you know, a couple thousand people, or the ones that have 10,000 people. So I think that I try not to use that word. It slips in here and there, but I do think that there's a value to the sense of thinking about sort of the gradients of change over time. Particularly, I don't know as much about terrestrial ecosystems, but I know at least in reefs, there's really clear changes that happen with different degrees of human impacts. So.
It affects current policy. It's like the historic preservation question. If you have a house that was originally built in 1690, and then it got added on, and you're doing historic preservation, what date do you work back to? And so the same issue is true whether you're dealing with reefs or with salt marshes or whatever.
Yeah, so I would just say one more thing, which is that I think that there's sort of two, I've done a lot of work on how you apply these baselines to conservation. I think it's really, really important to separate those two processes and say that historical ecology can tell us, to some extent, how things have changed, but it's really a social question in terms of how we want to use that information to plan for the future. So, you know, people probably don't want ecosystems that looked like they did in 1400 in the Caribbean, because there would be a whole lot more sharks, and we don't as a society necessarily want that, right? So I think the second part of it is a social question, but kind of arming people with that information that if you wanted to try to turn things back, these are the ways that the ecosystem has potential that we might not have observed in our lifetimes.
Bailey, did you want to speak to this question?
Actually, could I speak to that question, Jeff?
Okay.
Because I didn't want to imply that I thought John Locke or any of the other people I was quoting was right. That in the beginning, not all the world was America. Definitely, there is this sense that this is a pristine environment for European activity, but clearly that is the work of imperialism and not a description of a natural place.
So perhaps this is my own misanthropic perspective as a physical scientist, but you know, we go back 250 years to the colonialism here, and that's one perspective. We go back 1,000 times farther, and that's the middle of the last ice age. We go back 1,000 times farther, and that's when we think that the ice ages began. And I think to gauge what is different about the present level of human impact on the Earth, it's the simplest thing to think about is the level of carbon dioxide now, we are quite sure, has not been seen since that onset of glaciations around 3 million years ago. So that's a different scale as to the present human impact as compared to the human impact over the first million years of humans interacting with the environment.
We could talk about the boundary between nature and culture all night, but there might be other questions. So, otherwise, we'll keep going on that one. But do other people want to speak to something else on the panel, or? Yeah.
Yeah. In reference to the sort of recovering epistemologies that you talked about of specific plants and animals, bringing it back to sort of a maritime context, I'm interested in hearing some of your senses of applications this early work to sort of the shifting ideas of oceans and shorelines on a larger scale, and what impacts that had on attitudes toward ecology that then trickle down to those, more discrete attitudes about specific plants, animals, and treatments.
I can speak to that a little bit from the perspective of these pearl fisheries that I work on. One of the most remarkable examples, and I think too this might relate slightly to the first question, there are these moments of sort of tremendous disruption to ecologies. There's sort of slow change, and then these moments where everybody in a position to observe says, wow, what's happening here? And in the pearl fisheries, there are these astonishing reports towards the end of the 16th century, when the fisheries have been in operation for just about 75 years, when the descriptions of the piles of oyster shells on the coastline of these little islands that are devoted to this industry are so big and so full of rotting oyster flesh that they are, everyone's complaining about the smell, and the sort of just disgusting hordes of wild dogs that are sniffing around these piles, and that this actually forces people to reflect not only on the nastiness in their on-land environment, but everything that they've done to the oceanic environment, the maritime environment that they live right next to. Between 1575 and 1600. So that's pretty quick change. I mean, that's from an industry that really hits its peak, from zero to, in 5 years, it's really creating a lot of damage. And within 100 years, people are reflecting very explicitly on how damaging this is on land and at sea.
I can, picking up on that, I don't actually deal with oceans at all, except insofar as you have to cross one to get from New France to Old, which I'm interested in.
And then again, going back.
Yeah. But I can talk a little bit about like how suddenly these things can shift. The text I put out there was a book about ginseng that was published in the 17 teens by a Jesuit missionary who did this really interesting kind of comparative work about Chinese use of ginseng, botany, and then ethnographic study of indigenous cultures to argue that a plant he had found in Montreal was ginseng. And it turns out it's a related species. They're the same genus. But within 15 years, there was a harvest of ginseng. People went from not recognizing it as they walked in the woods to it being worth a fifth of the fur trade. A massive reorganization that sent plants from Montreal to Quebec to France and then on to China. And within 40 years, you can find reports of it being driven to extinction all along the St. Lawrence Valley, which then leads to invasions of native lands and a lot more destruction. But so the shift is actually can be quite dramatic.
Other questions from the audience? Yes.
So I think these descriptions are very helpful in terms of trying to understand baselines. How much of your studies reveal about governance, whether or not there's an equivalent sort of political shift in how to manage resources? Because it's one thing to observe there's a change in a pearl fishery or in a plant, but another thing altogether for the society to say, oh my goodness, we actually need to regulate or modify behavior.
I'll speak to that first, and I think Marcy, or Molly can follow in, anyone else. One of the things that was very striking to me as I wrote this book about changes in the sea in the North Atlantic is how, from a very early date, Europeans in the Americas were conscious of what we would call stewardship, or conscious of restraining rapaciousness. They were conscious of the fact when the European population and native and African populations here were very, very small, of reining themselves in. And you find this in Bermuda, where there's regulations early on for fishing and turtling. You find this in Massachusetts and Plymouth Colony, in New Haven, where they have, again, the United Colonies of New England in the 17th century are restraining the cod fishery during the spawning season so as not to destroy the cod, restraining the mackerel fishery in its time. Today, we would look back at that and say, well, there was like 20,000 people, European people, settlers, on this coast from Connecticut to Kittery, Maine at the time when they were beginning to pass these regulations, but they were clearly concerned that the sea of plenty lapping at their feet was not infinite. And so we lose sight of the fact that there was initially some of these conservation regulations, and I think, was it Molly or Marcy was pointing out, or one of you guys was pointing out earlier about these conservation regulations that have come up archaeologically from a very early day in native peoples. So our sense, and sometimes it's a political spin, that regulation is recent is really not the case at all. And there's some very, very interesting stories there.
I would just second that and say that the questions you raise are precisely those that I'm most interested in, and the point that I was trying to make earlier about the degree to which scholars of the early modern world have a lot to say and to learn from scholars of modern environmental issues. This question of the relationship between exploitation of human and natural resources and the state is present today, and it was present 500 years ago, and it's really quite astonishing in any number of realms, not just in the pearl fisheries, the degree to which and the rapidity with which the Crown responds to the data that's coming out of these settlements about what's working, what's not working, and how to manage it. So there are many specific examples I could give, but the short answer is they pay attention and they respond quickly.
Add to that. I'd say it also matters in terms of the relationships among different peoples. I mean, this works for native governments in that it seems like the Creeks actually passed regulations that you weren't allowed to share sources of minerals, like where there might be minerals, with the Spanish government, because, you know, obviously this has historically led to bad things, and that the idea was, you know, had to be kept secret knowledge and not exploited. And you also see this with the Spanish government in Louisiana, where there's this big debate going on amongst officials of, well, we want to attract settlers to this region and help develop the resources and such, so we want to bring in these Anglo settlers from places like the United States. But there's also several officials saying, you know, these U.S. Anglo-Americans have such a reputation as just rapacious environmental destroyers that, you know, if we bring these people in, they're going to wipe out all our trees, and, you know, we won't have much left. So are these really the kind of people we want to bring in? So.
I think we have time for one last question. Jack?
Well, I mean, if you bring up the question of governance, you also have to bring up the question of enforcement. And that's a really powerful limiting factor on all these early modern European empires, because they don't have much capacity for enforcement. That's why I'm really very skeptical about ever using a term empire as having some agency. I mean, there are individuals, settlers, adventurers, merchants, even an occasional bureaucrat who does have some agency, but it's a really, I think this is a general problem. Lots of people can think about regulations, they might even enact some regulations, but enforcing them requires some kind of consensus. For these things to have authority, as with any political system, they have to have consensus behind them. That's what gives them the authority. Without it, there isn't anything, except possessive individuals.
I just first of all wanted to thank all of the panelists. There's obviously a limit, you know, in terms of asking 6 people to come and give 5 to 10 minute presentations in terms of what can be discussed. On the other hand, I think that certainly, since all of you carried out your task with great aplomb, I think we can see that there are advantages to doing that as well, in that we've been able to in an hour and a half have an extraordinary range of topics, of approaches, of insights into materials, insights into methodologies that I'm very, very pleased by. I think that a lot in my mind, in terms of all of your discussions, took place kind of at the intersection of, on one hand, oceans and continents, borderlands, but also at the intersection of different kinds of relationships that humans have with other kinds of what might be called the natural world, whether they are conceived as part of it or as separated from it. The question of scale has been brought up on numerous occasions, a question that I'm particularly interested in, both in terms of thinking about how geographies work in very different ways and the limits or that exist in terms of us thinking about narrow geographical scales when addressing questions of ecological change. Baylor's question about the time scales, I think, is absolutely relevant, especially when we're looking at a collection that purports to begin in 1493 and goes up until the 1820s, but in fact speaks to all of human and geological and, in some ways, universal history. So I'd just like to thank everybody again. We'll continue the conversation around the table in the back. We have another 20-25 minutes or so, and then everybody is invited to join us at the English Cellar Ale House on Angel Street, just up from Thayer. I don't have the actual address, but it's right next to the Granoff Center, where we're going to be having some appetizers, drinks, and more conversation around these and other themes. So please join me in thanking Jeff for moderating the panel, and thanking the panelists, and you, the audience. Thank you.